All right, welcome again, everyone, and thanks, Kelly, for the introduction earlier. Welcome to this webinar on the Elastic Dynamic Authorization for API, Microservices, and Data. Couple of guidelines before we start. As usual, you are centrally muted, so don't you worry about the noise you might be making. You can eat lunch if you're having lunch. The webinar is recorded, so if you want to share a copy later with your colleagues, you can do that. You'll be able to find it on the Axiomatics website. And we'll try to save about 15-20 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session. There is a box in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side where you can type in your questions, and we'll get back to them either during the webinar or after the webinar. And again, welcome to this webinar on Elastic Dynamic Authorization for APIs, Microservices, and Data. Today, we will be two speakers. My name is David Broussard, and I'm joined by Jerry Gable, our VP of Business Development. Good afternoon, Jerry.
Hello, David.
Or good morning for you still, I guess.
Yes, it is.
So both Jerry and I have been at the company for nearly 10 years now. Jerry focuses on business development, and I focus on technical pre-sales and professional services. We often tag team to help customers understand attribute-based access control, as well as understand how they want to deploy their authorization solutions. So with that said, Jerry, how about we have a look at the agenda for today? Perfect.
Yeah, so here's what we're going to try to tackle today. We've had a number of these webinars, David, you and I, as well as in-person presentations at conferences. So it's a continuing theme of us to focus on APIs, microservices, and access control. So what we're going to cover today is a comparison of some different approaches for these services. And one of the real key themes that we focus on and talk about is some of the limitations when you're using only a token or a scope-based model for access control. And then more recently, David, you've come up with this notion of 10 Commandments of Authorization. So we won't cover every single one of them, but we'll show you what those are and go into some detail on a few of them. And then if the demo spirits are with us, I think you're going to show us how to get started by doing a demonstration of securing APIs and microservices with ABAC. Does that sound right?
That sounds about right. Yes, I did pray this morning, so hopefully everything should work well.
All right, very good.
So the background story, Jerry.
Yep, carrying on. Sure, go for it.
No, I was going to say, go ahead and tell us a bit more about API.
Yeah. So, of course, this is the focus of our presentation today. We use ABAC to protect different kinds of digital resources and content. But today, the focus is all around APIs and microservices. Of course, this is the way so many organizations and development teams are building applications today. Everything is available through an API, and behind that scene, there's a fabric or a service mesh of different kinds of microservices to represent different pieces of business functionality. And we can pull different pieces of microservices together to build composite applications. And we think actually you can deploy, and we see customers deploying an authorization service as a microservice. So it fits in line nicely with this sort of development and operational model.
Right, it fits really well with the mantra of function as a service, where each function is going to be a building block of its own that you can compose with other blocks. So through APIs, through microservices, as you said. And that, Jerry, is of course going to enable one of the bigger trends that we've observed lately, and that's digital transformation and the digital enterprise, right? Whereby a lot of businesses used to be pen and paper based, but nowadays everything is online, of course.
That's right, and there's different aspects of this on the business side on the left and the IT side on the right. On the business side, it's all about connecting people with data, with information, with resources. And it's a phenomenon that's obviously very prevalent in the industry over the last year or a couple of years. How can we remove friction to access data? How can we more easily drive our analytics or machine learning processes to get actionable intelligence out of this business information? But of course, there's also the need to properly secure it from the business side as well. And then on the IT side, David, there's a whole set of trends happening here that impact how we implement the APIs and the microservices-based applications. And that also means from an authorization and access control perspective, we need to be aware of these trends and fit into these trends. So it's about being cloud native, being able to deploy authorization services within Docker, being able to orchestrate these kind of capabilities through Kubernetes or similar kinds of orchestration tools. So it's a way to bring together the business needs and to make sure that on the IT side, we're in sync with that we're not introducing additional barriers or friction and on the IT side of things.
Correct. And as a matter of fact, Jerry, if we look at our history with our customers in the last 10, 15 years, it used to be that customers would want to have what they would call an enterprise authorization service that would cater to every single team across the entire enterprise, no matter whether you were a 50 people company or a 100,000 people company. But nowadays, there's more freedom delegated to individual teams, and they all want to run their own local authorization service. So the decision-making plane and the enforcement plane is decentralized or potentially decentralized, and then the control plane can be as well, or it can still be centralized to some degree. And being able to run that on top of the IT platforms of today, so you mentioned Docker, Kubernetes, but the bottom line is that you don't rely on a central team to provide these capabilities to you. Rather, you have the ability and the agility to spin up those services and those features as you need them. And Jerry, if we focus more specifically on API, which is one of my favorite topics, as you know, one of the websites where I spend a lot of time is programmableweb.com, where they have this great graphic, which is now a year old, but it's still, it shows the trend of iPhone. What's also interesting, by the way, is that these numbers are only for public APIs. So they typically exclude any internal APIs that businesses might have. So when it says 20,000 here in the top left corner, imagine that the real count might be 10 times or 100 times as many, because you have to include all those APIs being developed in-house. And what it's showing is that over time, of course, there's more and more web services, more and more APIs, and of course, nowadays, more and more microservices being built, like you explained, to be able to have the agility to compose different services together and create a bigger service altogether. And Jerry, just for the little anecdote, I went to the movies a few weeks back with my family, and we saw this great movie called Toy Story 4, which is the fourth installment of the series. It's in the title. And therefore, I felt obliged or compelled to put this little graphic here that the growth of APIs is not going to stop here in 2018 or 2019. It's going to continue. It's going to continue even faster. And like I said, again, this is just public numbers, not the entire private numbers. And Jerry, you were not familiar with Buzz Lightyear, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right. Yeah, I need you here to keep me up to speed on the current pop references.
Right. So, well, I'm sure that most of you on the webinar are familiar with Buzz Lightyear. And as you know, he keeps saying to infinity and beyond, and that's pretty much what we see happening with APIs and with the need for authorization with our customers. And so much so that, Jerry, you found this report from OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Platform, that mentions what the top security threats are typically, and you notice that between 2013 and 2017, so this 2 years ago, it had changed already to focus more on access control and APIs, right?
Well, and specifically APIs, you can see here the last one, A10, recognizing that unprotected APIs is a new issue here. So yeah, it's a couple years old, as you mentioned, but I think still quite relevant, that we should focus on this topic. So it's not just us saying that this is an issue, but certainly recognized by an industry-wide organization like OWASP.
Absolutely. Because APIs are such a convenient new door into different systems and platforms and data, they deserve the right level of security. Which, by the way, if we look at the evolution of APIs, right, they're not new, are they?
No, they've been around in different forms. We could probably go back farther than this chart shows, but if you think of the early days of ESBs or enterprise service buses and Corba, Common Decom, that's probably way before your time. But yeah, that's a convenient starting point when we when we think about topics like enterprise application integration, which evolved into SOA or service-oriented architecture, and that was the world of XML and SOAP and WS star kinds of security services. That was also the era when XML gateways first came onto the scene, products like Data Power and others from way back in the day, Layer 7 and so on. But now in the current method of deployment and development, where it's all about REST and all about APIs, and then going forward, even evolving into microservices and service meshes, right? It's really continuing to evolve, but still focusing around, I think, REST and API kinds of functionality, right, David?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting with the evolution of these, the way we handle APIs and services and interoperability, a lot of the focus has been on the security of the pipe, if you will. So, of course, very well-known mechanisms like SSL, TLS, authentication. You know, it's all about the transport typically, as well as getting into the door. But beyond that, there has not been as much work done on the finer grain aspects of security, and more specifically authorization. And that's where this webinar fits in, because we're going to specifically focus on these techniques. Also, Jerry, what's interesting is that it's not just about APIs, right? So it has been one of our key focuses here at Axiomatics, but we've noticed lately that a lot of companies are trying to make sense and monetize their data. And to do that, what they're doing is starting up these, quote, big data initiatives, of course, trying to gather, harvest the data, store it, analyze it, chunk it up in different ways to extract information and extract value, and then potentially resell that information they extract, or just use it to drive their business. So of course, you know, there's systems like Hadoop, there's systems like Spark SQL, and there's a lot of different capabilities being built on top of those data systems so that you can extract the information. But that means that they also deserve the right level of security.
Yeah, for sure. And in many cases, that data is being exposed via an API, but there's also other ways that we're trying to, you know, get advanced analytics or actionable intelligence out of this data. So yeah, it's a huge focus, but from our perspective today, in some cases, that data lake or data warehouse will be exposed through an API service.
Correct. And that brings us to the meat of the webinar today, which is how authorization has been tackled and how, going forward, authorization will be tackled in APIs and in other systems. So Jerry, right. You mentioned that there's probably a couple of those systems I did not know because I'm too young. Fortunately, your experience is here to help us, not to call it anything else. So if we look at the history, you know, you mentioned EAI, you mentioned also COM-DCOM and SOA, APIs, microservices. If we start overlaying the way authorization was tackled, there's always been homegrown, meaning that developers would actually write code in their apps, in their layers, to implement some form of authorization logic. But that evolved, right? With SOA, we saw things like SAML and XAML pop up, where SAML, of course, would focus more on identity and federation and single sign-on, but to some degree, also a little bit of authorization. And XAML too, right, Jerry?
That's for sure. And then, you know, homegrown continues to be a factor even today. And then once we hit the API emphasis and REST and JSON approaches, that's when OAuth 2.0 and its other forms like OpenID Connect came into place. And you also list here some framework-specific security methods as well.
Yeah, so what's interesting with framework-specific is that the underpinning trend is to move away from identity-centric or role-based access control to a more policy-driven means of handling authorization. And those framework-specific approaches, can, Laravel, Keycloak, and others, they actually do that to some extent in their own language, of course, but they do decouple the business from the authorization logic. So that's a really good first stepping stone in a way. And now, of course, if we look at microservices, you can add on additional standards that have popped up. The abbreviated language for authorization, or alpha, which is a true policy-based access control implementation, or open policy agent as well, that is a similar approach with a slightly different syntax for the policy language, but it's still policy-based. So these are all great initiatives that are going to help us scale authorization and implement better fine-grained authorization for APIs.
And a point to note here before we move on is that these are not mutually exclusive, right? You can use these in certain combinations, and that's actually what we'll be talking about here in the upcoming slides.
Right, absolutely. So Jerry,
yep.
I was going to say OAuth 2.0 OpenID Connect. Do you want to sort of explain to us how the flow works?
Well, just to point out that OAuth 2.0 was a real significant upgrade from the 1.0 version. It improved some of the flows here and some of the security of the standard implementation here, so that you're able to separate the client application from these two components called the resource server and authorization server. But the result is that you were able to generate access tokens that you could use to access downstream applications. And it was a way to, make a convenient way to access or delegate access from one user to another application, for example. And then OpenID Connect introduced some additional flows and some additional kinds of tokens to further facilitate single sign-on and access across different domains. So I think the real focus here is the fact that OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0 generate different kinds of tokens that can be utilized by an authorization service, such as from Axiomatics, to further implement access control in a policy-based way. Right,
and that's a really nice segue into the following slide. OAuth has been what I would call the hero du jour for API security. It's been one of the better ways, if not the way, to integrate different APIs together and have one API consume another API. And I would call that delegation more so than authorization per se, because what you're doing is you're letting an API consume or use some of the functionality of another API on your behalf. And it's been a really great way to do that. Also, you were comparing OAuth 2 to OAuth 1, but before that, there was SAML that was trying to achieve that same use case. What's made OAuth so compelling is that it's way more lightweight and easier to implement than past protocols. Now, in OAuth, there is attempts to tackle finer-grained authorization, and that happens through scopes, right? Where you're going to be generating scopes in the authorization server that will be inserted into the OAuth token. And those scopes eventually, Jerry, get consumed by the target application, and the target application can do whatever it likes with those scopes. So it's kind of falling back onto the ABAC way of thinking. Now, the scopes, they can be JWT tokens, JWT tokens, which is JSON based, which makes it easy to actually consume, parse those tokens. And you mentioned or alluded to the fact that fine-grained authorization services like Axiomatics can consume them. Well, one of the reasons we can so easily is because of the format and lightweightness. That said, Jerry, continuing on the Toy Story analogy, the problem with OAuth is that it's great for everything I'm going to call identity centric. It's not great as soon as you want to do relationships. The relationship between the API and the user, or the data behind the API and the user, or the transactions, and you want to drive your authorization off of those relationships. A typical medical example might be a doctor should only be able to view the medical record of a patient to have a relationship with. Well, that relationship is really hard to express as scopes, because you're not going to insert a scope per patient. You would end up with a really horrible OAuth token. One of my customers called it the Frankenscope issue. But given we're talking about Toy Story, I would call it the Sporky issue, where if you've not seen, or if you've seen rather, the latest movie, you know that this is a new character that a toddler builds in kindergarten, and she falls in love with the little character. But unfortunately, Sporky thinks it's trash, and it keeps running and tries to essentially jump in the trash. But Woody is there to save the day. So hopefully, Jerry, you can be our Woody today and save the day and tell us how to move forward, right?
We'll try to do that. Yeah, absolutely. So as you've been saying here, So we often see OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect used to secure microservices or API-driven applications. And they're absolutely great for lots of basic use cases and certainly do address this password anti-pattern, right? So it helps us from exposing our password to those delegated API calls like you described. But when we're handling more sensitive information, regulated data, and so on, then perhaps that's not quite enough. And I think this is where we can have an additional framework to enhance and extend what OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect can do from an authorization perspective.
Right. And again, I do want to stress what you said earlier and what you said again now is that we're building on top of the foundation. OpenID and OAuth are a great foundation to be able to build the finer grained authorization on top of that. So what should we look for in authorization? Like we said in the agenda, we have 10 commandments that we try to use. The number one, I would say, is you want to make authorization decorative. You want to have a policy that expresses authorization. There's a couple of reasons for that, not least the fact that you want to put the business back in control rather than have IT in control. So you want to have an artifact that everyone can understand. That artifact will be a policy. Excuse me. The second aspect is that you want authorization to be dynamic. Traditional identity-based authorization frameworks, role-based access control frameworks, rely on what we call birthrights. You're born with your permissions, and your user, your persona, will evolve with those permissions, perhaps gather more as they evolve across the lifetime, their digital lifetime, but rarely do we deprovision, rarely do we remove permissions, and you end up with users that are overly entitled. Making authorization dynamic means that you only get the permissions when you need them, okay? And as soon as you don't need them anymore, poof, they disappear, right? All thanks to attributes and policies. Number three is the fact that authorization shall focus not only on identity, but also all other dimensions. So it's multidimensional authorization. Identity, but also the action that the user or the service wants to do, the resource or objects that we're trying to get access to, medical records, transactions, accounts, but also contextual information like time of day or geolocation or other parameters that you want to use. If you know you want to use an attribute, chances are we can use them in a policy-based authorization framework. Number four is the fact that you want to decouple authorization from the application and from the data. The whole idea is that you might want to make your application functionality evolve independently of the authorization, and conversely, you want to be able to adapt your authorization based on external factors like regulations or law or business requirements, but you want to have those evolve independently of the application functionality. Then number five is one of my favorites. Authorization should be able to use relationships between the different dimensions mentioned in commandment number 3 here, so between the user and the resource typically. So that's the first half of the 10 commandments, rather. Jerry, do you want to walk us through the remaining 5?
Yeah, sure. Number 6, you alluded to this a moment ago, that authorization should be business driven. And that's where we think the policies enable you to represent business functions in machine language in a more easy way than we've been able to do in the past. Number 7 is about transparency. If we have access control logic hard-coded into an API or a microservice, then it's not very transparent. With policies, now we can audit those policies, we can report on them. They're easy to change over time, so that's a huge benefit. They should be scalable. You know, the partial title of our talk today is about elasticity for authorization. So we need to be able to scale to protect massive numbers of APIs, applications, users, data, and devices, and so on. Number 8, it's important to be technology agnostic. So we have talked a couple of times, David, about how things are evolving over time. So we want to make sure that our approach to protect APIs, data, and other resources is future-proof enough that our investments will serve us for a number of years, and it's not something that needs to be transitioned out already in 6 months or 1 year. And then finally, future-proof again. Don't make assumptions about tomorrow, and try to be open and as flexible as possible, so we don't make investment commitments that we're not going to get a return on.
And that's one of the key underpinnings of externalized authorization, is that your authorization engine is not bound to any one of the applications or services or APIs or data you're trying to protect. They're decoupled systems, so you can make your technology stack evolve, and your authorization service should be able to address the new technologies that emerge. And we've seen that, as a matter of fact. I mean, we started 15 years ago. Cloud was not as big of a thing. Docker did not exist. And if you look at how we deliver authorization today, of course we use Docker, of course we use cloud. So the authorization service was able to evolve and address these new services. So the secret sauce, if you will, you might have heard the term before, attribute-based access control or policy-based access control. It's a means to implement context-aware and dynamic authorization, whereby we'll make decisions when we need to make the decisions with the attributes we have at that point in time. So it's going to be fresh decisions rather than stale permissions, okay? And Jerry, what we're going to do is use, like I said, these multiple dimensions, right? Who the user is, what they want to do, what they want to do it on, when they want to do it, where they want to do it, why they want to do it, you know, what's the purpose of use, and how they want to do it. So all these are the dimensions that we get to play with in terms of defining authorization, which means that we can implement a lot of different scenarios, right? Export control, banking legislation, GDPR, and many more examples that I'm sure you see as well, Jerry, out there.
Absolutely. It's a generic framework. And on the next slide, we have the generic architecture for this kind of implementation. This is the basics. You know, the acronyms here actually predate the ABAC standard or XACML standard. What you have here is some type of user attempting to access a resource in the green box, and the PEP is the policy enforcement point. So that's the component that stands in the flow here and can intercept that flow and send a request to the policy decision point, or PDP. This is the authorization or engine or the runtime service that's making the access control decisions. So you've configured it with some policies from the policy administration point, or PAP. And then the runtime service can also connect to additional attribute sources. So in this case, we know that Alice is trying to view some record, but maybe we need to look up what's her location, her department clearance, and also information about the record. So the runtime service can do that. And then once we evaluate all that information, then we can return a permit or a deny back to the enforcement point. So as permit, obviously the flow continues unabated. If it's denied, then the user will get some kind of error message. That's the basics.
And actually,
for it. Yep.
In the ABAC flow, Jerry, we can also enrich those decisions, right? So we could say permit plus additional information, or deny plus a reason, or something you have to do, like rerouting to a two-factor authentication page, or sending a notification to a manager to notify that someone's trying to do something they're not supposed to be doing. So you can actually enrich those flows in ABAC.
Absolutely. And then speaking of enriching, then we can also enrich, sorry, David, we can also enrich OAuth and OpenID Connect and some of those limitations. One of them, I think one of the huge ones that we focus on is the lack of a policy language within OAuth or OpenID Connect. And that results in a number of negative consequences, right? One is the number of scopes potentially that you would have to implement. So we end up going from role explosion in an ABAC model to scope explosion here. So because you're either going to generate lots of different kinds of scopes, but this also could result in the token that you build could be actually quite large.
Correct, and that's what I alluded to when I was comparing Buzz Lightyear with Sporky, you know, the difference between what we've been promised and what's been delivered. With token bloat, not only do you get tokens that are harder to move around, actually some implementations have limitations on the size of tokens too, but also it's harder to understand what the authorization is, because you're still letting the applications do whatever they want to do with the scopes inside those tokens. So you lose control, you lose visibility, and you lose the decoupling or the loose coupling between the app and the authorization logic. So one way to do that, Jerry, is to minimize the number of scopes. So keep them to the strict minimum, have business-oriented scopes, meaning scopes that reflect what the user really is, a manager, someone in the given department, someone with a certain clearance level. So what I'm going to call key, core, or primitive attributes that actually reflect what a user really is. And then for the rest, for the relationships, for the functionality, we're going to rely on policy through an ABAC authorization service. And the glue that's going to bring it all together, or one of the glues that can bring it all together, is API gateways, right? API gateways have become a really easy and elegant way to integrate the enforcement process of an ABAC architecture with the backend APIs or the backend applications you're trying to use, and with the authorization tokens, the OAuth tokens that might come in from a client application. And what's also interesting, Jerry, is that you can do authorization on the way in, of course, but you can also do authorization on the way back. So if you're retrieving, say, a record from a backend system and you want to mask or redact information from that payload, with an API gateway combined with a policy-based or an attribute-based access control service, you can do that. And I believe that's one of the things you highlighted in a previous webinar with Jonas. So if attendees on this webinar want to know more, they can always go check that webinar out. And speaking of APIs, Jerry, here's the typical architecture, right? Where you have a client on the left-hand side, and that client is trying to consume some sort of capability or API on the right-hand side, and in the middle, acting the role of the enforcement point, we have the API gateway that will intercept the flow, send an authorization request to the Axiomatics policy server, the authorization service in step 2, eventually get a response back in step 5, yes, access is permitted, and then step 6, the call goes to the backend API. Now, when we mention API gateways, there are many to choose from, right, Jerry, that we've been working with over the past decade or so?
Yeah, quite a few, and this list continues to grow. I think the most recent ones added to the list are Kong and the Azure API Gateway. So it's great to see that. And this also, I think, David, highlights the value, the benefit, the importance of industry standards, because it's just a JSON and REST API that these gateways have to connect to. So it's super easy by configuration or a very small amount of custom coding, depending on how you configure the particular API gateway. Yep.
Yeah, it's very simple to plug the two together. It's native capabilities both on the API gateway side, it's native capabilities on the Axiomatics authorization service side, so it's very straightforward. And you can also build your own, right? You can always have your own gateways. One of our partners in Europe built lightweight gateway on top of Nginx that essentially intercepts calls and then converts them into an authorization request. It passes over to Axiomatics. So you don't always have to buy an API gateway. You can always go down the build it yourself or open source path.
That's right. There's so many options out there.
Correct. So how does it all tie together with OAuth and OIDC, Jerry?
Right. So in this example, we try to bring the two technologies together here. So on the flow at the top of the diagram here, this is where the user or the client is getting their OAuth token or their OIDC token as part of the authentication process. And we're showing that an API gateway is the enforcement point here that's able to extract those tokens and where necessary, call out to the Axiomatics service for additional validation. And this is important because the authorization service may have access to different kinds of context that's not part of the token issuance or validation process. It could be to check a risk score for that particular user, or some other factor that needs to be incorporated into the API call. So once that happens, then we've augmented what's done at the authentication and identity layer and enhanced that with a fine-grained and more context-aware authorization process.
Thanks, Jerry. And we're actually going to see parts of that in the live demo today.
Excellent.
Another aspect. Sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
I was going to say excellent, and now you're going to further describe the response processing of processing the payload on the way back from an API call that was successful from the front end.
Right. So that's what I mentioned a couple slides ago, that not only can you do authorization on the way in and determine whether the user has the right as a whole to view record 123, but also on the way back, determine whether they should be able to view all the fields or all the parts of that particular record. So in this example here that you put together with Jonas, we're determining that the user, yes, they have the right to view record 1, 2, 3. Great. So the call goes to the backend. We're retrieving the payload from the backend, and you can see here we have a region attribute, a PII attribute, and we have here's a field, record ID, tax ID, email, account balance. And then what the API gateway can do is for each field or each part, send an additional authorization request to the authorization service. It can do that in batch mode, by the way. It could say, hey, tell me which records the user is allowed to view. Which fields, the user is allowed to view. And then when the gateway gets the response back, based on the decisions that come back, whether it's a permit or deny, the gateway can actually remove the information from the payload to rewrite the payload before it gets sent back to the client. So that's a really neat way to do redaction of payloads. I'm not going to show that in this webinar today. If you want to see it, do tune into the previous webinar we did a few months ago. And speaking of which, Jerry, it's demo time. So what we've got here is simple setup. We're using an API gateway. Full disclosure, we're using Apigee, one of our partners, as an API gateway. It's sitting out in the cloud, and we're getting access to an API that's sitting in GitHub. It's a very simple JSON API that contains record data. We use records because we'll let you use your imagination and think that it's a medical record if you're in the medical field, or a banking record if you're in banking, or other records, LPs maybe if you're into music. And what we're going to do in this demo, we're going to do authorization on the way in only, and we're going to look at the record attributes, but also the user attributes. And what's interesting here is that we're going to do two ways of identifying the user. On the one hand, we're just going to use user identity passed into the URL. So this is very simple. And based on the user identity, we're going to retrieve additional metadata from a backend user API. That's one way of doing authorization. The second approach is that we're going to assume we don't have the backend API, and we're going to read all the information from a JOT token that is passed into the request. So rather than saying, hey, I'm dealing with Alice, I'm going to say, hey, I'm dealing with token. And what Axiomatics is going to do is parse that token blurb, understand who the user is, and understand their metadata, whether they're a manager or an employee, what department they belong to, so on and so forth. The policy we're using right now is a very simple policy we typically use in training sessions. So here we're controlling access to records, and you can see within my policy branch, I have 5 different policies, conveniently numbered 1 through 4 because we know how to count. And the main ones we're going to trigger now are going to be rule 1, a manager can view any records, and rule 2, an employee can view a record in their own department. So we'll see how to trigger these 2. Okay. And the data that we're going to be using is actually out there in the cloud. So if you want to click on the link and open that data, you can do that. So that's what I just did. So you can see here my JSON data. Nothing too fancy. It's an array, as you can see, of different data. And we have data record IDs 1, 2, 3, and then they all have metadata, the department, the owner, and the status. And then if I go back to my slides, we also have my user data. If I click on it, here we have different users: Carol, Dan, Tim, Bob, and Alice. We're going to be using Dan for the first example. So just remember that he's a client in finance. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and try to send an authorization request and see what happens. Okay. And to do that, I'm simply going to use Postman. Okay. And let me fire up my Postman. There we go. You can see here that I have different records, different requests, on the left. And those requests are essentially requests to Apigee, and Apigee will take them and do what it needs to do in terms of talking to Axiomatics. So here, by the way, all these endpoints are live, so you can play with them yourself. Here, what I'm doing is I'm saying, oh, I want to get access to record 1, 2, 3, and by the way, I'm Dan. So I'm cheating. Instead of doing proper authentication with, say, basic auth or something else, I'm just passing in my user Dan. This is obviously only for demo purposes. And if I send an authorization request, refresh that. There we go. We get access permitted to the transaction, to the record. We can see that a message was written by Apigee replying back to us. We can see also that the status of the authorization was 200. Okay, great. So Dan has the right to view record 131. If we go back and look at our data, we'll see that Dan, again, he's a client, he's in finance. And then if we look at 131, scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. The owner of the record is Dan, which is why he can get access to that particular record. So in this case, this is actually role. If I go back to my role description, this is role number 2.1. A client can view a record in their own department. Okay. Great, so that was one example, but now what I want to do is show that it's not just about passing the username as an attribute here, it's also passing information as a token. So when I use username Dan here, I'm actually relying on the user API that I showed you, but when I pass a token, I don't rely on that API anymore, rather the token contains the entire information. So the second request I can run is, can Alice, a manager, view record 131? And you'll notice that the endpoint is a little different. I'm not passing in username anymore. I'm passing in a header, and that header will contain the OAuth token. You can see it right here. We can actually copy the whole token, and we can go to this convenient website called jour.io. And if I scroll down, I can delete this, paste my value, and you can see that my job token contains the fact that my user is Alice. Great. She's a manager, she's in sales, and she belongs to the state of New York. Right. So with that in mind, if I send an authorization request, I should get access permitted because, Jerry, all managers have access to all records, right?
Yes, unless you've buried an exception in here somewhere, which you're known to do.
Well, yeah, as you can see, I've been having connectivity issues, but when I don't have connectivity issues, it does work actually. Access was granted. There is no exception. There's no trick. I was being nice for a change.
All right,
so,
no trick question today. That's good.
Yeah. So that's perfect. Access was granted to the transaction. Okay. Well, what if she was not a manager? You know, what would happen? So that's what we have in the following request here, where I'm also using a job token. So it's the same principle. That doesn't really change. But the job token now contains different values. So again, I can go copy my value, go to job.io, delete the current token, paste a new one, and you'll see that her role is quite literally not a manager. Okay. Let's see whether that still works. Let's send an authorization request. And now we're getting a 403 back. You can see the status here, but also you can see the error message that we're getting back that was also custom crafted by our policy, our configuration inside of Apigee. So here we're just simply saying not entitled to see data, please contact your system administrator. What if Alice, now she's an employee and she's in finance. So the third request, again, I'm going to grab the header. I'm going to copy it so we can see what it contains. And I'm going to paste it. And you can see that it says Alice, employee, finance, New York. Okay, great. And if I go test that call, I should get access permitted. So let's try that. And I do. Great, access permitted. Now, what's interesting here is that it's only access permitted because, if I remember correctly, she's in finance, and then 131, record 131 is in finance too. It means that if I picked 130, it shouldn't work anymore because 130 is in engineering. So let's give that a go. Now we're going off script, Jerry. This is where the fun stuff happens. So we're going to try 130. Do send that again. There we go. Not entitled to see data. Please contact your system administrator. So what we've proven here is that the relationship between the data and the user, whether the user comes in from a user API or from a token, that doesn't matter. The relationship is what drives the authorization.
Fantastic.
And yeah.
Looks like the demo spirits were with us today.
Yes, they were. They were. If anyone is curious to see what the actual authorization request looks like, here's an example. This is a straight copy paste from Apigee, so the value line is specific to their way of inserting variables. But the rest, the request, access subject, resource, action terms, and the curly brace and the whole notation, that's part of the XACML JSON request response profile that is, aiming to make integration and breeze. And happy to say that there's more and more implementations of that profile. So it's a pretty cool thing. And then just to wrap it up and leave some time for Q&A, Jerry, here's a nice little summary. that we put together just to give attendees a takeaway from this webinar.
Yeah, David. So I think you've just shown how you can combine the token-based model from OAuth or OpenID Connect, and along with ABAC, using the policy power of ABAC to address a broader set of use cases or requirements. So I think that's fantastic. And you also showed how simple that is to do. And so we, along with that, we want to recommend that you use scopes for their intended purpose and not try to use them beyond the delegated consent issue. This will help you to avoid having to define so many scopes for the different use cases that you might encounter. Allow the policy model of an ABAC system to handle that for you. This also means that your APIs themselves, we think, can be streamlined quite a bit, because you don't have to worry about encoding that access logic now into your API. What to do with the scope can be externalized into the ABAC authorization functionality and make that a very dynamic service for you as well. And then you didn't really get into it today, David, but the authorization service itself can be deployed in a container or as a microservice. So that really fits in with a DevOps or DevSecOps model, and gives those dev teams, those engineering teams, a lot of independence, because they can control the entire life cycle of the authorization service. They don't have to rely necessarily on an external department or group to manage that for them. And so, of course, we're happy to set up a separate call and dig into any of this a little bit deeper, and further test those demonstration capabilities. So, David, I think that's a wrap for the content.
It is. So let's have a look at Q&A.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please do enter them into the GoToWebinar question box, and we'll address a couple of these here before we close out the session.
I'm trying to open up my panel.
Yeah, see, we have one that's come in, David, that asks about the console to create the policies. So we didn't do that today. We have had other webinars that show this, or of course that's something we can show during a private demonstration session with you. But we do have a couple of ways to define policies. One is the graph model that David showed a screen capture of. But David, you also mentioned Alpha earlier in the session, which is the abbreviated language for authorization. And that's also a great component for development teams to be able to use themselves in an IDE like Eclipse, so they can write their policies there and and deploy that to a containerized runtime of Axiomatics. Right.
And we do have great video on using Alpha and using Alpha in a CI/CD environment from the Identiverse conference that took place a month ago that we'd be more than happy to share with anyone who wants to tune into. A couple more questions, Jerry, that came in. Can you talk a bit about leveraging Axiomatics and Istio? So Istio is a service orchestrator / gateway. Yeah, Istio can be used as a policy enforcement point. It would be a great policy enforcement point, especially for east-west traffic, rather than the traditional API gateway role of north-south traffic. And in Istio, they've already planned for an extension point. They have something, I believe it's called an authorization handler or an authorization template. I don't quite remember the exact term. And following that, you can implement an enforcement point that can call out to Axiomatics and determine whether the call flowing through Istio should be authorized or not authorized. So to us, Istio is a bit like a micro gateway, if you will. Another question that came in, how does Axiomatics relate to OPA? So OPA stands for Open Policy Agent, and it's a relatively new means to address attribute-based access control. OPA focuses mainly, not only, but mainly on infrastructure, right? One of their big use cases is authorization for Kubernetes. Axiomatics is a little bit broader than that. It has a background in applications, APIs, and data. And Axiomatics builds on top of two standards called ZACWL and Alpha, which date back to 2001. So they're more widespread and a bit more mature than Rego, which is the underlying language with an open policy agent. the whole idea is the same though. The whole idea is indeed to externalize authorization. There's a couple more differences, such as the fact that within ABAC and Axiomatics, you can use external attribute sources, policy information points. Within OPA, you can only use the information you have available at the point in time you use open policy agents. But they're pretty compatible models.
Yeah, David, those are terrific questions. I think we have a very aware audience with us today. So
yeah,
excellent questions.
And we also, I forgot to mention, but we also do have a presentation that kind of draws the state of the art of authorization, comparing not only OPA and Axiomatics, but also AWS have their policy language that is to some degree similar to OPA and XACML and Alpha. So these are all great initiatives moving in the right direction of externalizing authorization.
Indeed, they definitely validate the entire concept. So I think we've got time for one more question here,
yeah.
David. So this one is about our comments that OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect don't have a policy language. And is there anyone working on this, or any of the standards bodies working on addressing that issue? And I think the simple answer is no. I don't believe the concept of a policy language really has been considered in the OAuth 2 world. Is that a fair statement?
Well, so I was going to say, I was going to answer differently, Jerry. So no, it's true within the context of OpenID, in the context of the OpenID Foundation. But yes, absolutely within the context of OASIS, which is where XACML and SAML come from. And this is where I've been spending most of my time, is in the standards bodies implementing the next generation of policy standards for authorization. So XACML, like we said, was born in 2001. Version 3 came out in 2013, if I remember correctly. And now the next generation is Alpha. Alpha is a way more lightweight representation. It's something that anyone can read and write extremely quickly. You can edit it in any ID that you want to use. And it maps directly into XACML, which means that you can use your existing XACML authorization engines like Axiomatics or open source engine, and you're good to go. So there's really two streams of work happening. One is taking Alpha to the next step. Two is also making request response even easier than ever before, right? So the JSON profile is a great step in that direction.
Excellent. Yeah, David, just to clarify, I was referring strictly to the OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect communities.
Right.
I don't think policy language is part of their charter, but absolutely, we've been working on the XACML policy language for many years. Correct.
And OpenID and OIDC or OAuth are looking at integrating with us. When I say us, I don't mean Axiomatics, I mean OASIS, right? Collaborating together so that standards can work together and benefit from one another.
Perfect. I think that's a great way to finish up our session today. So David, great to do another webinar with you. Thanks everyone for joining us. And our next webinar is coming up in 2 or 3 weeks. Our colleague Jonas will be heading that one up with our partner Radiant Logic. So hope to see you there as well. David, great to do another webinar with you. Thanks very much.
Equally. Thanks. Bye now.